the laugh cut sharper than a knife against bone-high, careless, and cruel. It carried across the trading post yard, bouncing off the dusty clapboard walls, riding on the hot wind like a bullet meant only for him. Kai froze where he stood, his hand resting against the hitching rail to steady his aching ribs. He didn't have to look up to know who it belonged to. He'd know that laugh anywhere. Mara, his ex-wife. The woman who once swore to ride through every storm at his side. But now she walked past him on another man's arm, the banker. Clean-shaven, soft-palmed, with a fine vest stretched over his belly and boots that had never touched mud or blood. Beside him, Mara gleamed like a polished jewel, her golden hair pinned high, her silk dress fluttering against her ankles. She didn't even flinch as the dust clung to the hem, because she had new wealth now, new comforts. She had traded fire for feathers, scars for silks, a warrior for a banker, and she laughed. At him, Kai's jaw tightened. His body was a map of ruin. Once, the name Kai Redhawk had meant something in these border towns, an Apache warrior whose shadow alone could silence a room. He had been strength carved in flesh, the kind of man enemies hesitated to face and allies looked to in awe. But the battles had stripped him. Broken ribs that never healed right, bullet scars that tore muscle from bone, nights of starvation in the desert, months of betrayal and loss. Now he stood with hollow cheeks, his shirt torn at the shoulder, his dark hair tangled from weeks of labor. He was not the man she had once known. The crowd gathered like buzzards around carrion. They didn't speak, at least not at first, but their silence was worse than words. They watched. Their eyes crawled over him, waiting for something, maybe hoping for shame. And Mara gave it to them, that laugh spilling from her like a victory flag. "Poor Kai," she said lightly, though her voice was pitched to carry. "Still clinging to scraps?" Her banker husband chuckled, puffing on his cigar as though smoke alone made him powerful. His hand tightened possessively at Mara's waist, and she leaned into him. A display not of affection but of triumph. Kai said nothing. His pride, what little of it remained, would not let him. Yet inside, her words cut deeper than any knife. He turned his face slightly, away from her glow, toward the sunburned earth. The heat rose from the ground, the grit stinging his cracked lips, and still he stood there, refusing to fall. Refusing to give her that last piece of himself. But his silence was not strength. It was fire choking in his throat. Mara tilted her chin toward him, her laughter softening into mock pity. "Oh, Kai," she murmured, though the venom lay sharp beneath her honeyed tone. "The warrior looks more beggar than man these days." The crowd shifted uneasily. A boy snickered. A woman whispered to her neighbor, too low to hear. Somewhere, a dog barked, the sound abrupt and hollow in the heat. Kai drew in a breath, and his ribs burned like coals. He could feel the weight of every scar, every defeat. He could feel the years that had pulled him down, grinding his bones into the dirt, but worst of all, he felt her laugh echo inside him because once long ago, that same laugh had filled their small cabin with warmth, had softened nights of hunger, had been the music that promised him he was not alone. Now it mocked the ruins she had left behind. He pushed away from the rail, his legs unsteady but his gaze steady as stone. Mara's smile faltered for just a heartbeat when she saw the fire still glowing in his dark eyes. Not extinguished. Not yet. The silence between them stretched, a rope pulled tight, ready to snap. Then the banker cleared his throat, adjusted his vest, and led her toward the saloon, his boots clicking sharply against the boardwalk. Mara looked back just once over her shoulder. Her lips curved in another cruel smile, but her eyes betrayed something else, something quick and hidden. Fear? Regret? Or just the thrill of watching a man she once loved turned into dust? Kai didn't know. All he knew was that the laughter still rang in his skull, and the whole town had heard it, and though he looked broken, something inside him whispered a vow. They will see me rise again. Kai Redhawk's legs nearly buckled as he walked away from the trading post. Each step sent a hot spear of pain shooting up from his ribs, a reminder of wounds that had never healed right. The dust rose around his worn boots, clinging to his bare chest where old scars crossed like faded lightning. Once, he had been a storm himself, an Apache warrior whose presence made men think twice before drawing their pistols. But now the storm had broken, and what was left of him felt more like scattered ash. He reached his horse, a thin, aging bay with ribs almost as visible as his own. The animal lifted its head and snorted as if sharing in his humiliation. Kai touched its neck gently, as though apologizing for carrying his burden. Behind him, Mora's laughter still echoed. It wasn't just sound anymore. It was memory. Once it had been warmth, now it was cruelty made flesh. He closed his eyes against the sting, but closing them only made it louder. Kai. The voice was soft but steady. He turned and saw Lila. She was waiting for him outside the general store, holding a sack of cornmeal against her hip. The evening sun touched her dark hair, and though she was only 30, hardship had carved strength into her features. She wasn't adorned with silk or jewelry. Her dress was plain, her hands calloused, her boots dusty from endless miles of labor. Yet her eyes, storm gray and alive, were more fierce than any dress Mara had ever worn. Kai tried to straighten, to hide the tremor in his body, but she saw it anyway. She always did. You shouldn't stand there listening to her, she said, her voice low but firm. Her laughter isn't meant for you. It's meant to break you. Kai's lips twitched, almost into a smile. Then it's working. Lila stepped closer. Dust swirled between them, and for a moment, she simply looked at him, at the once great warrior now leaning on a rail to keep upright. Her hand, small but strong, reached for his, prying his fingers away from the splintered wood. You're not broken, she whispered. Not to me, but Kai's gaze dropped to the scars that marred his chest, to the ribs that stuck out like broken fence posts. He thought of what the townsfolk had seen, a warrior stripped of pride, mocked by the very woman who once swore to love him until death. Maybe you're blind then, he muttered, bitter and tired. Lila squeezed his hand, hard enough to make him meet her eyes again. No, I see clearer than they do. You've carried battles no one here could survive. You're alive, Kai. That's not ruin. That's strength. Her words stirred something deep inside him, though it was faint like embers beneath ash. He wanted to believe her, but belief felt as distant as the mountains on the horizon. He pulled himself onto his horse with a grunt, each movement heavy, and Lila mounted her mule beside him. They rode out of town in silence, the whispers of bystanders lingering like gnats on their backs. When the cabin finally came into view, a small, leaning thing of weathered wood against the endless prairie, Kai exhaled slowly. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Smoke curled weakly from the chimney, promising warmth. Inside, Lila set the sack on the counter and stirred the pot that had been left on the stove. The scent of beans and herbs filled the room, modest but comforting. Kai lowered himself onto the bench by the fire, his body creaking like the old wood beneath him. She brought him a plate, setting it before him without a word. Kai stared at the food. His pride warred with his hunger, but the look in her eyes left no room for refusal. He ate slowly, each bite grounding him, pulling him away from Mura's laughter, back into the rhythm of survival. You don't need her voice in your head, Lila said suddenly, her tone sharper than before. You don't need their whispers. Let them call you ruined. I know what you are. Kai looked up at her. And what am I, Lila? Her gray eyes flickered with fire. A warrior. Even if they can't see it now, the word sat heavy between them. Heavier than the meal. Outside, coyotes howled in the distance, their cries raw with hunger. Kai felt a strange kinship with them. He was hungry too, not for food, but for something more dangerous, for dignity, for a chance to rise where no one thought he could. He set his plate aside and stared into the fire. Mara's laughter still lingered, but this time it didn't echo as loud. Instead, another sound whispered through him, Lila's voice, steady and unshaken. A warrior. For the first time in months, Kai felt the faintest stirrings of belief, not in Mara, not in the town, not even in himself, but in her. The prairie wind turned savage that night, rattling the cabin shutters like 100 restless fists. Dust hissed against the walls, and the sky above split with veins of white fire. Thunder cracked so loudly it shook the boards beneath Kai Redhawk's feet. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with smoke from the hearth. Lila bent over the iron pot, stirring beans and dried venison together. The smell was earthy, simple, humble food that filled a man enough to last another day. She hummed low, a tune without words, her gray eyes glancing now and then toward Kai as though she knew he wasn't really seeing the fire at all. Kai sat on the wooden bench, his back against the wall, bare chest gleaming in the flickering light. His long black hair hung over his shoulders, tangled from wind and work. The tribal jewelry he wore, strings of bone and turquoise. A feather pendant gifted to him long ago caught the glow of the flames. But the light only revealed what he wished hidden, the deep scars cut into his flesh, the ribs that jutted out like broken canyon ridges. His hands lay on his knees, strong but trembling, and his gaze was locked on the fire. To Lila, he looked like a man staring at ghosts. And she wasn't wrong. They laughed at you, Kai. The voice was Mara's, sharp and merciless, echoing in his skull. They saw what you've become. He closed his eyes, but the storm outside seemed to echo her mockery. Each thunderclap was a cruel laugh, each gust of wind a reminder of his fall. Lila broke the silence first. "Eat," she said gently, setting a tin plate of beans before him. He didn't move. She sat across from him, folding her hands in her lap. "I know where your mind is." His jaw tightened. "Do you?" "Yes." Her tone was even, unshaken. "It's still back there, in town, standing in front of her." Still hearing that laugh, Kai's head lifted, his eyes narrowing. "How can I not?" She took everything good and dragged it into the dust. "My name, my pride, my strength." He tapped his chest with a finger, hard enough to make the ribs ache. "Even my body is a shadow of what it was." The storm outside rose, lightning flashing across the window. Lila didn't flinch. "You're wrong," she said. His laugh was bitter, humorless. "Am I? You're not a shadow, Kai. You're still here. You lived battles that would have buried any other man. You walked out of deserts no one else would survive. That's not ruin. That's proof of what you are." He looked at her, really looked. Her face was soft with youth still, though hardship had lined it with resolve. Her storm-gray eyes held him steady like a rope keeping a man from falling into a canyon. "They don't see that," he muttered. "Let them blind themselves," she shot back. "I see it." The wind howled louder, shoving against the cabin as though trying to tear it apart. Kai stared at the door, imagining the whole world out there trying to push him down, just as Mara's laughter had. And for a moment, he almost let it win. Then he clenched his fists, the old fire sparking deep in his chest. His ribs burned, his scars ached, but the ache reminded him of battles fought, of blood spilled that had meaning once. He would not let her laughter define the rest of him. "They'll see me rise again," he whispered, almost to himself. Lila leaned closer, her voice steady. "No, you don't rise for them. Not for her. You rise because you are Kai Redhawk. And nothing, not scars, not whispers, not her can take that from you." The word struck deeper than he wanted to admit. The thunder rolled again, but this time it didn't sound like laughter. It sounded like drums. Old drums. War drums. He inhaled slowly, and for the first time in months, The air didn't burn his lungs with defeat, it filled them with something else. Something dangerous. Hope. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, another storm was beginning to stir, not of wind and dust, but of fire and resolve. Redhawk was not finished. Not yet. The town square buzzed with life the following Saturday evening. Lanterns swung from the saloon's porch, their light painting gold across the dust, while fiddles struck up a tune that carried into the warm air. Couples danced, merchants laughed, and children darted through the crowd. Redhawk stood at the edge of it all, leaning against a post. His long black hair fell across his shoulders, and his bare chest gleamed faintly in the lamplight, scarred but unhidden. He wore his tribal jewelry proudly, beads and bones strung together in defiance of the whispers. Yet the whispers came anyway. Ruined, someone muttered behind him. Used to be a warrior. Now? Just a shadow. The words coiled like snakes, biting deep, but Kai didn't move. His dark eyes scanned the crowd, though he already knew who he was searching for. And then he saw her. Mara. She emerged from the glow of the saloon, her silk dress shimmering under lantern light, her golden hair pinned high with jeweled combs. On her arm was her banker husband, face flushed with drink, cigar smoke curling around his soft jaw. Together, they looked like royalty in a land of dust. Her eyes swept across the crowd until they found Kai, and her lips curved into that same cruel smile. "Well, if it isn't my poor Apache," she said loudly, loud enough for those nearest to hear. "Still haunting shadows, Kai?" The nearby laughter faltered, but only for a moment before rippling again, small and uneasy. Kai's jaw tightened. He felt the burn in his chest, the same burn he had felt days earlier. Lila stood beside him, her storm-gray eyes narrowing. She had come with him to town not because she wanted to, but because she refused to let him face these nights alone. Mara stepped closer, her silk swishing in the dust. She tilted her chin, examining him as though he were an old horse past its use. "What a fall," she said sweetly. The mighty warrior, now leaning on scraps. Kai stayed silent, his pride demanding it, though the silence felt heavier than words. Lila's hands clenched at her sides. She had listened to enough. She stepped forward, her voice ringing through the night. "Better a ruined warrior than a gilded liar." The square went still. Conversations died. All eyes turned toward the young woman who had dared to speak against Mara in public. Mara blinked, her perfect smile faltering. "Excuse me?" "You heard me." Lila's voice was steady, unwavering. "You dress in silk, but your heart is smaller than the dust under my boots. You laugh at him because you're afraid to remember the truth." The banker barked out a laugh, though it sounded forced. "Careful, girl. You don't know who you're talking to." "I know exactly who I'm talking to," Lila shot back. "A woman who left a man of fire for a man of coin. And still she isn't satisfied." The crowd shifted, murmurs spreading like wildfire. Mara's cheeks flushed, though whether from anger or shame, none could tell. Kai's eyes flickered to Lila, and for the first time in weeks, something like pride swelled in his chest. She was defending him where he could not, speaking truth where his silence had failed. Mara's eyes narrowed, venom seeping into her voice. "You think you've saved him, do you? You think that warrior still lives? Look at him." She gestured toward Kai with a sweep of her jeweled hand. "Nothing but scars and memories." The crowd's eyes turned back to him. Kai stood tall despite the ache in his ribs, his scars glowing in the lantern light. For a heartbeat, he wondered if Mara was right, if all he truly was now were the ruins of battles long past. But then Lila slipped her hand into his. Her grip was steady, her gaze fierce. "He is Kai Redhawk," she said, her words cutting through the murmurs. "And he doesn't need to prove himself to the likes of you." The silence that followed was deep, broken only by the distant wail of a fiddle. Mara's lips parted as though to speak, but no words came. Her banker husband shifted uneasily, pulling her closer, muttering about leaving Dot at last. Mara gave a brittle laugh, softer than before, hollow at the edges. "Let the girl believe her fairy tales," she said, turning away. "It changes nothing." But as she walked back toward the saloon, her shoulders stiffened, and for a fleeting second, Kai saw something he hadn't expected in her eyes' uncertainty. The crowd slowly dispersed, though whispers lingered in the air like smoke. Kai stood tall, his chest still burning, but not from shame this time. From something else. Something Lila had given him. The storm outside their cabin had planted the first ember. Tonight, in front of the whole town, Lila's words fanned it into flame. Kai Redhawk was not just the ashes Mara wanted him to be. He was fire waiting to rise. The night was quiet, save for the chirping of crickets and the low hum of voices drifting from the saloon. Kai Redhawk was on his way back to the cabin, Lila at his side, when the first scream tore through the air. Fire! The cry came from the edge of town, followed by another, louder, more desperate. A thick plume of smoke curled into the sky, glowing orange at its base. "The banker's barn," someone shouted. "It's going up." The two-story structure loomed at the far end of Main Street, its roof already licking with flames. Heat rolled into the street, sparks scattering like angry stars. Horses shrieked from their stalls inside, their hooves pounding against wood in panic. Children cried. Men rushed with buckets, but the flames ate faster than water could tame. Mara stood in the street in her silk gown, her jeweled hands clasped to her mouth, eyes wide with horror. Beside her, her husband the banker stood frozen, cigar still between his fingers, his face pale and useless in the glow of the blaze. "Do something!" Mara shrieked at him, but he only stammered, his boots rooted to the dust. Lila's hand clutched Kai's arm. Her storm-gray eyes flicked to his. She didn't need to say a word. Kai moved. He threw aside the bucket someone tried to hand him and sprinted straight toward the inferno. His bare chest gleamed with sweat, tribal jewelry bouncing against his scarred skin. Flames roared like a beast, but he didn't slow. He smashed his shoulder into the barn door until the weakened wood gave way, and a blast of heat swallowed him whole. Inside, the air was hell. Smoke clawed at his throat, choking him, searing his lungs. Horses screamed, their eyes wild, ropes tangling them in their stalls. He grabbed the nearest, slicing through its halter with his hunting knife, shoving it toward the open door. "Go!" He barked, coughing, the sound more growl than word. One by one, he cut them loose, driving them toward freedom. Sparks fell onto his skin, burning hot against old scars, but he ignored the pain. His muscles strained as he dragged his stubborn calf by the horns, pulling it through the smoke. Another kick from a frantic horse caught him in the ribs, and he stumbled, his chest aflame with agony. Still, he rose. Still, he pushed. Through the haze, he spotted a small figure huddled in the corner. A boy no more than 10 curled into himself, crying, too terrified to move. Kai's vision blurred from smoke, but he staggered forward, scooping the boy into his arms. The child clung to his neck, coughing against his shoulder. With the boy held tight, Kai shoved his way through the wreckage. Beams cracked overhead, one crashing down, narrowly missing them. The fire roared, greedy and merciless. Finally, the door burst open before him, and Kai stumbled out into the night air. The crowd gasped. Kai emerged with the boy in his arms, soot blackening his skin, sweat and smoke clinging to his long black hair. His scarred chest heaved as though every breath might break him apart, but his arms were steady, protective, unyielding. He set the boy down gently, patting his back until the child coughed the smoke from his lungs and ran into his mother's embrace. A hush fell. Even the crackle of the flames seemed distant. Mara's jeweled hand still covered her mouth. But it wasn't laughter this time. Her eyes widened, shining not with cruelty, but disbelief. She saw him not the ruin she mocked, but the warrior she once loved, the man who had faced death 100 times and spat in its eye. Her banker husband, pale and trembling, had not moved an inch. Lila rushed to Kai's side, her hands touching his scorched skin, her voice sharp with worry. "Kai, you'll kill yourself." He coughed, doubling over, but lifted his head, dark eyes blazing through the soot. They needed saving. Around them, the crowd whispered, but not with ridicule this time. The word that spread through the dust-laden night was different. Now warrior, he went in alone. Redhawk still got fire in him. Kai straightened slowly, wincing with every movement. The storm from nights before stirred in his chest, stronger now, no longer just embers. For the first time since Mara's laughter broke him, the town wasn't looking at ruins. They were looking at Kai Redhawk, the Apache warrior who refused to be finished. Morning sunlight spilled across the town like golden dust, but the streets carried the smell of smoke from the night before. Ashes still smoldered where the banker's barn had stood, and blackened timbers jutted skyward like broken bones. The fire had been contained, but it left its scar, a scar that belonged to the banker as much as it belonged to Kai Redhawk. For once, though, the townsfolk weren't talking about the loss. They were talking about Kai. The blacksmith leaned against his anvil, retelling how Kai had carried the boy through the flames. The shopkeeper whispered to a customer about the horses he'd freed. Children gathered in a circle on the boardwalk, mimicking his stride, their eyes wide with the drama of it all. "He just walked right in," one girl said, her braids swinging. "Like the fire didn't even scare him." Kai heard it all, though he pretended not to. He walked slowly down Main Street, every step weighed by the bruises on his ribs, the burns on his arms, and the ache in his chest. His long black hair, still smelling faintly of smoke, fell loose down his shoulders. Tribal beads and feathers clinked softly with each movement. The whispers followed him, but they were different now. Not the mocking laughter of ruin. Not Mara's venom. These whispers carried something else, respect, and that made Mara furious. She stood on the steps of the boarding house, her silk gown catching the sunlight. Even in the daylight, she shimmered like a jewel set against the dusty wood. Her jeweled hands rested on the railing as her eyes narrowed at him. "You think one night makes you a hero?" Her voice cut through the morning air. Townsfolk turned, their conversations halting, as her words slithered through the silence. Kai stopped. He didn't answer. "You're still nothing," she went on, her laugh brittle and sharp. "You think saving a barn full of animals and one boy makes up for what you've become? Look at you. Ashes cling to you because that's all you'll ever be, ashes of what you once were." The words bit deep, but this time Kai didn't bow his head. Before he could reply, Lila stepped forward from the crowd. Her plain prairie dress brushed against her boots, her storm-gray eyes flashing like steel. "Enough, Mara," she said, her voice steady but strong. "You're blind if you can't see what he did. He saved lives. While you and your husband stood frozen, he risked everything." Gasps rippled. No one ever stood up to Mara, not in public. The banker, red-faced, puffed up as if to defend his wife, but even he couldn't ignore the murmurs of the crowd. Shame flickered in his eyes. Kai met Lila's gaze, and for the first time in years, he felt something stir, a fragile ember of pride. He lifted his chin, his dark eyes locking on Mara. "I don't need your approval," he said, his voice low, steady as a drumbeat. "I don't live for your laughter anymore." The silence that followed was heavier than any insult Mara had ever flung. The crowd shifted, their eyes leaving her and returning to him. Some nodded. Some simply watched. But none were laughing. Mara's face tightened, her painted lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, She looked less like the radiant jewel she flaunted and more like a brittle shard, sharp but fragile. She grabbed her husband's arm and turned away, her gown swishing angrily as she disappeared into the boarding house. The crowd began to disperse, murmuring once more, but the sound was different now. Stronger, respectful. Lila stepped closer to Kai, her hand brushing his arm gently. "You see?" she whispered, her storm gray eyes soft now. "They're starting to remember. They're starting to see you again." Kai exhaled slowly, the ache in his ribs pulling at him. He looked past her to the smoldering ruins of the barn, then up at the sky. For years he had lived beneath Mara's shadow, her laughter chaining him tighter than iron. But here, in the ashes, something new was rising. Not the man Mara had ruined. Not the warrior he once was. Something in between. The Apache within him stirred, no longer buried in shame, but standing again scarred but unbroken. And this time the town was watching. The days that followed the fire carried a different weight. Where once the townsfolk had turned their backs on Kai Redhawk, now they nodded when he passed. The blacksmith tipped his hat. The shopkeeper offered fresh bread without asking for coin. Even the preacher clasped Kai's hand after Sunday service, his eyes shining with gratitude. Kai didn't ask for their respect. But it came, piece by piece, like scattered stones slowly building a wall. He spent his mornings helping Lila repair fences at the cabin, his scarred hands working steady and sure. At night, they sat by the fire, the silence between them no longer heavy, but calm. Lila's laughter, soft, unforced, began to replace the echoes of Mara's cruel one that had haunted him for years. Mara's laughter hadn't vanished entirely. One evening, as dusk painted the town in shades of gold and blue, Mara appeared at the cabin. Her silk gown was dust-stained from the walk, and her jeweled hands fidgeted as if they no longer knew what to cling to. Behind her, the banker did not follow. Kai stepped out of the barn, shirtless, his long black hair falling over his shoulders, tribal jewelry glinting faintly in the fading light. His eyes narrowed at the sight of her. "What do you want, Mara?" His voice was calm, but iron lay beneath it. She looked at him, really looked, and for the first time in years, her laughter wasn't on her lips. Instead, her storm of beauty faltered. "I didn't come to mock you," she said quietly. "I came to say, I saw you that night in the fire. I remembered who you used to be." Lila stepped from the cabin door, her gray eyes sharp. "He's still that man." "You were just too blind to see it." Mara flinched, but she didn't turn away. Her painted face held cracks now, the shimmer of her gown unable to hide the brittleness beneath. "I was wrong," she whispered. "You were never ruined. I left a warrior behind, and I chased after nothing." Her jeweled hand trembled as if she meant to reach for him. But Kai didn't move. He let the silence stretch until the night birds began to call. Finally, he shook his head. "You laughed at my ashes, Mara. You tried to bury me in them. But I rose anyway. And I won't crawl back to your shadow." Mara's eyes glistened with tears she refused to shed. She turned slowly, her gown sweeping the dust as she walked away. This time, there was no laughter trailing behind her, only silence. Kai stood still, watching her disappear into the twilight. Lila moved closer, her hand brushing his. He didn't pull away. Instead, he let his fingers curl around hers, grounding himself in the warmth of the present, not the ashes of the past. That night, the town gathered in the square for a small dance. Fiddles sang, boots stomped, children twirled. For the first time, Kai joined them. He stood tall in the lantern light, his chest scarred but proud, his tribal jewelry catching the glow. When the fiddler struck up a steady rhythm, Lila took his hand, and together they moved across the dust-packed earth. The crowd parted, watching as the warrior who had once been mocked now strode among them, unbroken, a live dot. No one laughed. Not Mara, not the banker, not the whispering men who once called him ruin. Instead, they clapped. The music carried into the night, and Kai Redhawk felt something he thought had died with his marriage, with his pride, with his past. Hoped that he was still scarred, still bruised. But he was standing, and the warrior within him was no longer silent.